and it should ask you for your permission, and you can click if you don't want to participate. All right, so let's get started. We're here today to talk about the Spotify model, something that's been, I want to say, hyped in the agile world for the past couple of years. And that's both a good and a bad thing. A good thing is because everybody starts paying attention. A bad thing is, well, because there's a couple of downsides to it as well. And we'll definitely get to that. I want to start off with a brief introduction about who I am and who the company is that I work for and typically sponsors this meetup. It feels a little weird, sponsors this meetup. They used to buy the pizza and the beer and the drinks and everything at the in-person meetup. So my name is Martin. I'm an Agile coach at Agile Cockpit and a professional Scrum trainer at Scrum.org. History as a software developer, and I'm responsible for the United States expansion of Agile Cockpit and am currently available for engagement. So if you do happen to know of an opportunity for contracting work, feel free to let me know. I would greatly appreciate it. Agile Cockpit is an organization that helps any kind of organization in their agile transformation, but we do have an emphasis on IT departments because that's where it typically originates. And from there, when we take up the whole organization, we can both help by providing agile coaches, doing full transformations, even digital transformations. And we supplement that with a training offering and some pieces of software that can help accelerate transformations. Agile Cockpit is headquartered in the Netherlands, and we have more than 400 professionals worldwide. And as I said, I originated in the Netherlands and then expanded the company here, which is really exciting. So if you want to learn more about who I am and what I do, feel free to shoot us up on LinkedIn after the meetup. So let's go to a quick outline for today's meetup. So I'm gonna start with a brief introduction of the Spotify model, like just to set the stage and know what we're talking about. What is this thing that draws so much attention? Then we're gonna look at where it usually goes wrong. I already mentioned this briefly. Like there's a couple of very common pitfalls, and well, the Spotify model has gained a lot of traction. It has also gained a lot of criticism, especially from the agile circles, the circles of agile coaches, scrum masters, and maybe even leaders in the agile space. But then we're going to flip it around and look at the true value of the Spotify model. And the true value, as opposed to like the introduction, is going to make sense once we get there. And then finally, we're going to look at how you can leverage it to your benefit. And at the end, obviously, there's room for conversation and closing questions and all things alike. I do encourage participation in the meetup. So feel free to share opinions, thoughts, ask questions. You can either do so by speaking up or by writing something in the chat. I will pause at certain times to look at the questions in chat and allow for people to write them. So we'll definitely get to that. I might bench them until the end of the meetup in case they do not have like a one-on-one relation to the topic we're discussing right now. Other things I do want to mention is the slides are going to be shared on the meetup page in our website tomorrow, and I will try to add the recording to that at the same time. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. So introduction to the Spotify model. The Spotify model really originated in 2012 when Henrik Nibberg and I think one of his co-workers called Iverson wrote what I call a white paper about the Spotify model. That's sort of like was like the first time they really exposed and wrote down the way they were working at Spotify back then. And they built on that in 2014 with two excellent videos on Spotify engineering culture. And I think that's part of what gave it a lot of traction in the end, because those videos, I mean, they've been watched over and over again. I use them in classes whenever I'm at a company for like a custom agile class. I always show these videos, like there's a lot in there. And that's partially due to the fact that all this content is very well presented, right? So it's easy to digest. What also helps in the popularity of the Spotify model is that the terminology is different from traditional organizations. The same, obviously, you could argue for things like Scrum, because Scrum uses different terminology. But I think the simplicity of the whole is part of its popularity. And it's a great success story for scaling Agile. Spotify obviously has been tremendously successful over the past couple of years. doesn't mean to say that they haven't faced their challenges, but the way they've scaled and the way they've been able to maintain their culture is absolutely excellent. And the final thing, I think, in my opinion, that really helped make this model popular is because it's from Spotify. I mean, like I said before, Spotify's success story. It's an application that most people have positive associations with. Most people have even used until Google and Apple finally caught up with their music streaming services, right? So I think the total picture of this really helped bring this to become what it is right now. So let's look briefly at a simplified overview of the Spotify model. And this image comes from the original 2012 paper. I think there's a slight evolution of this and some real life examples in the engineering culture videos. By the way, I will link to those tomorrow when I post the slides, just for your reference. So what Spotify basically did is a different take on the matrix organization. And I'm just going to put this out there because it's still a matrix organization, even by their own admittance. But what they did is they took as a basis agile teams, regardless of what they were doing. It doesn't matter if it's Scrum, if it's Kanban, if it's a mix of those, if it's something else. Typically, true agile teams use like a mix of these things, and they named them squads. And same setup, right? So they have a product owner, and then you have the self-organizing, cross-functional team working on something. And they group these squads into tribes that have like a common mission. So you could have a tribe for mobile apps. You could have a tribe for a desktop app, right? Within that tribe, across the squads are the chapters. So in the chapters was sort of like a solution for the challenge that they were facing, that if you have like 4 UX designers in different squads, then how are you going to make sure that they are aligned, that they're not reinventing the wheel and building the same kinds of solutions time and time again? So that was part of the reason why they came up with chapters, to ensure that cross-pollination and that knowledge sharing was still in place. The other angle for chapters is, and this is mentioned in the engineering culture videos, is that people could change squads without changing line manager, because your line manager was operating on the horizontal chapter level, basically. I do want to nuance that though, because good team principles are that you don't change teams often, right? Because it takes a time before a team to become really used to each other before they become a really good performing team. So saying like, hey, yeah, they're in the chapter with the line manager so they can just switch without changing line managers. I think the odds of people switching are the same as a line manager going somewhere else. So I think the strongest angle here is to make sure that that knowledge sharing is still in place. Then overall, because the chapters are within a single tribe, overall you have the guild. The guild is really like it's sort of like a meetup within an organization, right? So they could have, say, an HTML guild for people that are interested in HTML. They could have a jazz guild for people interested in jazz. It doesn't really matter what it is because it's quite voluntary, right? If people join or not, and the time spent in it is fairly limited, but it really allows people with common interests to gather, and that really fosters innovation, fosters self-organization, and really builds on the culture that they ultimately want to have, right? So in addition to all the things mentioned before, right? So you got your squads, like the verticals within tribes, and then you got your chapters within the tribes, your guild across the tribes. Within each tribe, there's also an agile coach. And this is where they might have deviated a little bit from, like, say, Scrum, because Scrum sort of says like every team has a Scrum master, and just sort of like a little twist on it. So each tribe has the guidance of an agile coach. And I've seen like a variety of different takes on this in real life. Like some have like an agile coach and Scrum master, some do other things. Some even have a tribe lead as like a chief product owner. And I think even in one of the videos from Henrik Nyberg, he mentions that there's like a chief product owner is like a coordinating role, not hierarchical, but more like making sure that they're all heading in the same direction. In the original Spotify model, though, the intention was that these product owners work together to make sure that they're aligned, that there's like an overarching roadmap. One of the biggest things about all that you're seeing here, right, is that it's all very loosely coupled. So you have these squads that operate fairly independently. The only reason they're in a tribe is because they have something common, like I said before, like mobile apps or like building desktop applications, or I know they had an operations tribe in the past. I'm not sure if they still have that right now. And so it's not really because they have to be in the tribe together. It's because it just makes sense, and because then a cross-pollination across those squads really work. And it might even mean that these different squads within a tribe have like an overlap where they might need to communicate more frequently. So one of the things that they say in that white paper is that like there's no formal scrum of scrums within a tribe, but because they're in a tribe together, there might be a need for them to have it. So each tribe is like a different way of operating that suits them, basically. So I'm going to pause here very briefly for questions or remarks or experiences.
Well, what happens if somebody wants to change a tribe or move from to another squad?
That's a great question. I am not 100% sure of the answer, so I can only quote from what I've heard from people that have spoken to people at Spotify. From what I've heard, it's fairly self-organizing, right? So if you have the intent to do something else, you can obviously talk to your line manager. They still have those in place at the time. And then you look at like, where's that fit? Like, where do I think I can be of most value within this? And then you just talk to those teams. And it's not really different from how Agile's supposed to work, and even how Scrum intends it to be, right? If you want to move somewhere else, just start the conversation with the people that are best suited to help. So in this case, there's obviously a line manager that has to be involved, but it would also make sense to involve the Agile coach and see how they can support that. But typically it has to come from people themselves. That's a true power of autonomy and self-organization, I'd say. Does that answer your question?
Thanks.
I have one question. Is
Sure.
the line manager depicted in this picture?
No, not depicted. No. I think there's a variation of this in the video. I believe a line manager can either be separate or just be part of one of the squads. Really depending on the size, because the true picture of this is like not all tribe has like 4 squads in there. So it could be there's like 10 squads, or it could be that there's just 3, right? This is the picture perfect picture, but not reality. Andrew, did you have a question?
Yes. So would you say it's fair to say that Spotify has really marketed the cross-functional teams better than a lot of people have done in the past? Because Scrum to the beginning was all about cross-functional teams, right? And doing that. And so this part of the model, I don't see as being that different from what Scrum has always been pushing, what I've been doing a lot of times in the past, but I just say they marketed it well. Is that fair?
I think so. I think that's really fair. And they even admit it, right? So all of what we're doing, like, it's not unique, it's not rocket science. I think one of their employees at a conference in 2016 even mentioned that part of this came from a white paper from 1962 or something. So it's like, they didn't invent this. This is just like a snapshot on how they evolved and what worked for them at that time. And the marketing is just really, really good. And to be fair, I'm thankful for that, because people are now focused on self-organizing teams. So I think everyone benefits.
Yes,
That's a great point. Yeah, great point, Andrew. Thanks.
Martin,
So I have,
based on my reading, I gathered that their cross-functional teams really, one of the reasons why they paid so much attention to that, because they wanted to reduce dependencies with other teams. So they put anybody and everybody who responsible for delivery of a product onto one squad, at least how they started, right? They could put marketing people, they can put procurement people, so kind of above and beyond what we usually put in the Scrum, on a Scrum team.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that, because that's to Andrew's point, like that's how Agile teams are supposed to be from the start, and even how other organizations are doing it. So Again, it's really excellent that they're so vocal about this, because they are showing the rest of the world that doing that really works and has huge benefits, right? Because they did it because it works and because it made sense for them. What is interesting though, is that there's like this huge, or has been for like the past 10, I don't know how many years, DevOps movement, right? Merging Dev and Ops into the same team. And Spotify has chosen to have operations be a separate tribe. And I'll talk to that a little bit later on, but it's just interesting how all those things shifts and are different.
And
Great
there's
point.
another interesting point, that what you're showing is just how they started. And remember, when they started, they were fairly small startup. So as a
Yes.
startup, everything was very informal. So that's why it really worked well. Between then and now, they put much heavier emphasis on the chief architect, how the tribes of tribes work together. It just tells you again that, yes, one thing that it worked really well when they were very small and startup-ish, and we know how agile works really well in startup organization. And when we start looking at organizations like Federal Reserve and implementing something like this, Spotify now as well has a fairly heavy top layer, if you will, that connects all of it together. I'm just curious what you think about their evolution.
Well, there's a lot of interesting things that you're mentioning. So this is what came into existence, I think, when they went from like 30 to 100 people. And then by the time they published the videos, they were at like 300 or even more, right? So a couple of things I want to mention there. It's easier to do this from the ground up, right? I'm not sure if Agile works better in startups, because I've been speaking to quite some startup leaders over the past couple of weeks, and they're all not really doing it, but they're agile by nature because it's so low key and there's fewer people, right? So, but if you really grasp on that and then build it properly, and this is what I think Spotify did, then it's easier to expand that. And as they grow, and I think I read they have more than 3,000 employees right now, maybe even 4,000. Obviously, you're going to have to do more to create that alignment. And I'm not too sure about how their top layer, if you will, is organized right now. But for an agile organization, you would want that still to be very light and very focused on self-organization. But obviously, the larger you get, the trickier it becomes to achieve that, to maintain that loose coupling, basically, because like 4,000 people, it's hard to organize. So I would assume there might even be a different layer now.
And
I'm not sure.
they did published a number of I don't remember whether I saw it, whether it's videos or just additional white papers that came out last year. So that's where they describe additional layers to their organization. If you
Okay, that's a good hint. I have to admit I haven't checked those out for the preparation of today's meetup. I want to go to the core of what it was, but it's
Yeah, I have a
Mark.
I have a question, Martin. So,
Sure.
can there be a product which is in one tribe, but dependent upon the product which is in the other tribe?
Yeah, and that's what happens all the time, right? So that's even what they're facing, and that's why, and we'll go a little bit deeper in a second, but that's why they really focus on teams, one team enabling the other teams, right? So they want to reduce dependencies by nature. So they want to make it easier for these teams to collaborate. And again, this is part of the reason for the success, for example, of AWS, because they're all microservices, right? So it's easier to build like the bigger whole if you split it up into smaller independent pieces that can operate independently, yet other teams can leverage through things like APIs. And I think this is part of what Spotify has been doing. They even gave an example is where they had like the traditional monolithic desktop application, and they split that up into different modules because working with all those people in a single code base sort of came back at them. It wasn't effective anymore. There were simply too many dependencies. So they pulled it apart, started exposing these different components through APIs, and that sort of took away a lot of these painful dependencies, if you will, and just minimize the dependencies to those that you would have in any case, right? I need something from that team. Like there's an example in a white paper, I think even says like, we're waiting for a data dump from that team, right? Those are the dependencies that you always have, I'd say. But they really minimize them by decoupling everything and strongly focusing on microservices and modules and things like that.
Martin, I wanted to ask, because I know you raised it earlier, how were they able to manage? I mean, I know they're huge now. The fact that there was no duplicated work done across the tribes or the squad.
You don't really. The chapters are supposed to be a solution to that. Two things about that though. So one, you're never really going to prevent it, even in traditional organizations, right? There's always this one person somewhere that's like, hey, I need this, I'm going to build it without checking. And it's really hard to keep track of like huge code bases in that sense, or at the very least, it takes a lot of effort. And then the second thing is you got to ask yourself, like, how terrible is it that within two tribes, there might be two pieces of the same functionality to support the work within a tribe? Sometimes it might even be necessary, right? Because you simply don't know at the time that you're building it, how it might evolve. So I think aiming for not too many duplicate code is a very noble cause, but it shouldn't become like a goal in itself, because then you're just going to be reducing things to crazy levels where you're probably going to spend more time working around it than you're going to spend on delivering value. So you really have to strike a balance. And I think the chapters are striking a good balance in that. And I can speak from experience as a developer, having been located inside a chapter, not at Spotify, but elsewhere, is that it does work. You do have that knowledge sharing, that cross-pollination that you need. And if then somebody else on the other side of the organization decides to do something, then, well, it might not be that bad.
Can I just ask, I'm actually very interested in knowing what the team dynamics were in terms of, you talked about the guild, you talked about the chapter, because I think that's what would have made it such a huge success, the team dynamics. How were they able to make it work? I mean, practically. I don't know if you have an answer to that.
Well, I haven't been at Spotify to observe it myself, but I can say this about team dynamics, right? So you should always have a primary team that you're focused on. If you read the book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni, this is something where he really focuses on with the leadership team, the fictional leadership team that he's talking about. And you got to pick a primary team that you're dedicated to. And in this case, that should be the squad. So the chapter in that sense is people from the same discipline get together, make sure that you, like to your question before, like you don't get that duplication, you're sharing knowledge, you're sharing experiences, you're sharing challenges. But it's not your primary team. It's just a group that you meet on a less than regular basis. And the guilds are even a step further back from that, right? So that you just meet, say, once a month, once every 2 months, 1 or 2 hours at the end of the day. So there's like really no commitment to that in a sense. It's just like really voluntary participation. So I think it's squad primary. This is where you really focus on getting to know each other, building the team performance. Then there's a chapter, same discipline, knowledge sharing, maybe that line manager component, maybe a little bit of personal development, and then guild, like, hey, I think HTML is cool. I just want to go there and learn from others and maybe share some of my experience. So I think that's the way you could look at this. Does that help?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm sure that probably would have helped because they had an open conversation, just thinking out loud. And so it was easy for a team to migrate from one squad or tribe to the other. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. All right, so now we've had a look at the overview. So let's look at where it usually goes wrong, like the common pitfalls. And let's start with the first one. And this has been rebuked. I know, I'm going to get to that in a second. Like, it's been used as an operating model rather than as a scaling model, right? So organizations have taken this and say, this is how we're going to operate right now. And that is not what it is. This has been used by Spotify as a way to scale an already existing agile organization to from like 30 to 100 to 300 to 2,500, 4,000 people, right? So it's been taken as a scaling framework, not as an operating model. And some even say like, hey, it's not a scaling framework, it's just something that Spotify did at that time that worked for them in order to scale. And I tend to agree with that. I don't think this is even a framework, right? It's a snapshot of what they used to do, but it's based on very good foundational principles and cultural aspects, something that I'll get to in the next section. So having said that, if organizations want to take the Spotify model and start using it, they need to remember that they need agility first, and then it can help you scale. And that's in my second point, organizations simply implement this. I've seen this is right now you're in a chapter and you're in a squad and you guys are a tribe. And then what has changed? Absolutely nothing at all. Why? Because it doesn't make you agile, right? It assumes there already is an agility in there. And that's, if you want to treat this as a model or a framework, and I know there's different opinions about that, which is perfectly fine. But for the sake of simplicity, let's stick with just considering it to be a model for this meetup, right? Implementing it without those core components in place is just putting different labels on things within an organization, right? And that's where it differs from things like the Scaled Agile framework, which has things in there to actually help you become agile. And again, people have opinions about all these things, right? So that's perfectly fine, but I'm just comparing like what one has and what the other hasn't. So if you want to go with this, be very mindful of the fact that you need your people, you need your leadership, you need to make sure that you actually change the culture and mindset that you need to become agile as an organization, rather than hoping that this might get you there. And moving that even further, it creates agile in name only at scale. It just plots it to the rest of the organization. It's just like, hey, no labels, no labels. And if people don't understand the underlying mindset, like what kind of behavioral change comes with this, what kind of cultural change should take place for this to really work, then I'm not sure what you've really changed. I've seen what happens to people, and they're attending all kinds of. I've taught all kinds of product owner classes, right, with people from the same organization over and over again, different people. But and I would say, yeah, well, obviously that we're called tribes now, but then I asked them, like, what has really changed? Well, nothing. It's just a new label. The change still has to happen. Then again, you could also argue that changing it and then becoming agile might not be the worst thing. At least it's a step in the right direction. My strong opinion, though, is that if you start changing your organization and reorganizing it, and you're not focusing on that cultural change, mindset change from the outset, then you're setting yourself back a little bit. And then it takes a lot longer to really enact that change over long term in the organization. And so people need to understand it. People need guidance from like agile coaches that can help organizations, agile coaches, scrum master, doesn't matter what you call them, right? Transformation coaches, to help them guide them in the right direction. Because like implementing this model is one thing. I mean, organizations are capable of that. They are capable of redesigning the organization. But introducing the mindset and culture, you need specialists for that, right? The same as I'd say 1 or 2 decades back when organizations started to become lean, or maybe even longer, right? They needed the green belts and the black belts, and I don't know how many belts there are, right? So if you don't have that and just think like, hey, there's a white paper, a couple of videos, let's do it. Not really sure if you get there. And finally, there's like the point I made before, like Spotify says there's no such thing. It's like a snapshot. Spotify is continuously evolving. And I think that's a hallmark sign of a truly agile organization, that you are constantly changing. So when I quickly move to a comment here, I think from Manwai, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Apologies if I didn't. Culture is also a big component. People who work in Spotify told me that the culture in HQ in Sweden is very different from the New York office. Their New York office doesn't do anything close to the Spotify model, even though Spotify has already changed that so-called model. That's a very good point. That's a very good point. You have different cultures, and I can tell from experience that work culture in Europe is very different from work culture in the United States. So you got to cater to that as well. And this is a model that originated from their Stockholm offices in Sweden, right? So thinking that it might work over here in New York, I'm not sure. Like there's a company that tried this and failed miserably for years, not understanding culture. It's called Disney. When they opened like Disneyland in Paris, they failed year and year and year. They didn't really understand why they weren't making the revenue that they were making in the United States, because people love Disney. People bought everything that was over there. But consumer culture in France is really different from the United States. So that's something that organizations always need to remember. All right, so I want to move on now to the true value of the Spotify model, right? I don't want to bash it too much because I do think that for better or for worse, it has brought the agile movement a lot of good things. And I think this is really the core to Spotify model, right? So it's the mindset behind that. And I've mentioned this a couple of times before. It's all about loose coupling, but tight alignment, right? So we got that mission. We're building a music player, but we all have like a different role in getting it there. And this is, again, similar to how Amazon does it with AWS, right? So we're building cloud services. We have like a common shared vision, mission, whatever, but we're all moving there in a different way, at a different pace, right? And that's perfectly fine as long as we achieve that goal. And one of the really strong things that they focus on is autonomy. The only way this model is even going to work is if you have autonomous, self-organizing teams. Again, this is nothing secret, nothing new. If you've heard of the book Turn the Ship Around from David Marquet, a former Navy submarine captain, I hope I got that right. He speaks about this as well, right? Giving people autonomy, having them make their own decisions, giving them ownership of what they're supposed to do. It doesn't mean a complete relinquishment of control. It means that we're just empowering people and giving them a lot more to decide on their own, and with that a lot more freedom, and with that a lot more responsibility in order to help us move quicker and get even further. So there's a couple of things that they really mention. So community over structure, right? So we want people to be able to find each other and not end up in organizational structures. It doesn't matter if you're in a different squad, different tribe, different chapter, whatever, you can just talk to each other, collaborate, work together, really focus strongly on making sure that people can find each other. It's a tricky balance, right? Because the traditional comics about IT organizations are somebody in the IT department complaining that there's somebody at their desk again, right? You know, that like with a request interrupting. But if everybody understands how this is supposed to work and this becomes like part of your culture, then community over structure really, really works. It's like, hey, we're doing this together. We're in this together. And sure, we have a structure, but we want you to focus on a collaboration first and then structure only when needed. I'd say it goes hand in hand with trust over control, right? So you have to trust the people you hire to be able to do the job, to be able to make certain decisions. One of the things that my former manager in the Netherlands always used to say is that, why should we micromanage you at work when you're allowed to drive a car, get a mortgage, all these kind of things that are tremendously more impactful or even dangerous than what we can do here at the office, right? So why shouldn't you be able to make like all these decisions yourself? Like how many vacation days do you take? Like when do you take it? When do you go to your customer? I, as a manager, don't need to be involved in that, right? So we hire you because we trust you to do the job, and we give you that trust and give you that autonomy, right? Sure, there's always that little bit of control that you need to limit blast radius, right? So there's like certain laws and regulations that you need to stick to as organizations. So obviously there's always going to be some sort of control. But you really want to emphasize the trust part. Like, we hire you for a reason and we trust you to do it. And this is like a chicken egg kind of story, right? So leaders typically want to see that people can handle trust first before they give it. But people typically need to be given the trust first before they can act like they have it. So it's like, you got to break that cycle, basically. Another one is enable over serve, right? So, and this is about the operations tribe that I mentioned before. So Spotify, at least back then, did have an operations tribe, which is contrary to like the popular movement at the day, and maybe even still today, is to have operations and development in the same team. Then again, using that as like a blanket organizational design principle might not be the best approach either. But what they're saying is that these teams should operate like they enable all the other teams to consume the services that they have, rather than serve them and do things on demand. So I'm going to pull in AWS again with their examples. They expose everything through APIs. Like they have like small components exposed through APIs, and it makes it incredibly easy for other teams to consume that. So with that, you eliminate like a ton of dependencies. You enable the other person, the other team, the other squad to do something. It's something I've done in my times as developer. Like the whole organization, we had a huge web application framework and applications built on top of that with like 52 core modules, and that was on top of like the 200 custom built modules for clients, and they were all really tightly coupled. So eventually we started pulling that apart and just enabling other modules to consume what they needed from one module, to make sure that there were no dependencies anymore, that it didn't serve it, it just makes sure that they could consume those services. And that's how they see operations at Spotify, right? They enable other teams to release their software. They don't do it. They don't do the releases. They make sure like, hey, here's your pipelines. This is all the components that you need in order to get it to production, right? That's what enable over serve means. Again, a common one, principles over practices, right? You don't want to, nobody truly cares how exactly you run something like your daily scrum or your daily stand-up, but it's about the principles. Why are we doing this? We're doing this to inspect and adapt progress towards a common goal that we have. It doesn't really matter how you call it, how you run it, right? But as long as you focus on the foundational principle of why we're doing something. Next one, cross-pollination over standardization, right? Standardization is a huge thing in organizations. And Mercy, I think this is a little bit about what you talked about before, like how do you make sure something doesn't happen twice? Along the same lines as how do you make sure that everybody does things the same way? First of all, if you're loosely coupled, if you're building microservices, it doesn't matter, right? Because the inner workings of one component versus the inner workings of the other component don't matter, because they're talking to each other through APIs, right? So if one does something way A and the other way B, doesn't matter. But even then, you might want to have some consistency, right? Because that makes it easier to do the next thing I'm going to talk about, is that you want to make sure that it comes from the ground up and people talk to each other in chapters and guilds, and make sure that through that kind of exposure, you do get that common goal. And this is where at one point you're going to trigger like a flipping point where you're becoming like huge, and then enterprise architecture comes in. And enterprise architecture is something that is really, really tricky to do. It can be done really properly and really on a high level, but it's really tricky to strike the right balance. And it speaks to this a lot, but if you always keep focusing on cross-pollination over standardization, you're going to be moving in the right direction. It doesn't mean no standards, right? You want to have a standardized character set for your database, for example, right? Otherwise, you're seriously going to mess things up. You want to have standardization around security principles, around privacy, right? That's all good. But for all the other things, focus on cross-pollination. And again, don't worry too much about if two teams are doing things differently. And finally, this is part of what really works well for Spotify, and what I've seen work well in other organizations, especially to reduce dependencies, is an internal open source model, right? So team A, squad A, can change the code of squad B. The only caveat is that somebody from squad B does need to look at it and approve the change before it becomes, before it's merged into the live code base, before it becomes like a true thing, right? Just to make sure that they've dotted their I's and crossed their T's, and it's in accordance to the coding standards and principles of that squad, right? But then again, the majority of the work has already been done by squad A. So if they're stuck and they need a piece of functionality from squad B, they just build it, ask someone from squad B to look at it, which typically takes considerably less time than building it, and then they just move ahead. Works perfectly fine in reducing dependencies. All right, so a lot of information there. I am going to pause briefly for questions, remarks, any experiences.
Hi, one small question. Do they follow any iteration kind of thing, like time box? Do they have any time box?
Yes, I'm not sure about what I remember it to be 2-week iterations, I think, but
Okay.
then again, that's sort of like an de facto standard right now in the industry. But yes, obviously. So even if they're not dictating teams to use Scrum or Kanban or everything, but you need those iterations anyway. Even if you're just doing Kanban, you need that backstop, right? You need that feedback loop in order to reflect, to talk. So I'd say I know for sure they're using iterations. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
And one remark I do want to make: within a tribe, it helps if the iteration is aligns for all the teams, right? So you can have 2-week iterations and 1-week iterations, right? And then at one point they're going to align. But 3 weeks and then 2 weeks, that's going to cause like a whole different mess because there's not going to be alignment, right? So you want to make sure that you can even give teams autonomy in saying how long is your iteration, as long as they match up in the overall feedback loop, right? So that's a key component, I'd say, if you're talking about that.
Okay. Yep. Thanks.
Martin, would it be fair to say they just carved out their own principles and values to galvanize the team to be able to operate, right?
I would say that's fair. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Anyone knows why Spotify went away from the so-called Spotify model and doesn't really exist as the model? Any insight?
I have a thought there because it's a snapshot, right? If you're doing Agile properly, you're continuously evolving as an organization. This is the biggest Agile transformation pitfall, is making it another massive transformation, right? It's a massive effort. Sure, any transformation is a massive effort, but big bang transformations don't have the desired effect because you're going to spend a lot of time and effort disrupting everything, and you're still not going to teach the organization to evolve, to continuously change, to make small changes on a day-to-day basis that help the organization grow, that make it easier for people to do their jobs, that make it easier for people to deliver the value to their customers. So, and this is what they're saying as well. Like what you're looking at right now might be outdated tomorrow because we're just continuously adapting and making these smaller changes. And that's why it's not the same anymore.
And I don't think they abandoned the model. They still have squads, they still have tribes. They created, as I said, additional parts and pieces to it, right? They came up with tribe leadership, different product charters, technical chapters, and such. So they keep evolving it. And as they said from the beginning, it's never been a model, never been a framework. It's just something that we use. So I wouldn't say that they necessarily gone away from it. I say they just keep working and improving it.
Keep evolving it, right, Masha? Yeah,
Yeah.
That makes sense.
That's the right word. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I did read something today about like it was mentioned before that there's like a chief architect. I didn't read up on that, but I did read they did introduce additional constructs on top of this, right? To as like an evolution of the model. So I really don't think they abandoned this, for sure. All right, so let's move on to how to leverage it, because it talks a little bit to this as well, and why this has been so successful for them and why it can be very successful for you and any other organization, right? So how to use it. I got to fix that typo. So you got to make sure that you're Agile first, I'd say, or at least have an understanding of the Agile principles. You really want to make sure that people understand that, because If you're not focusing on being agile in the first place, then any scaling framework is just simply not going to work. I'm going to make a small however there for the Scaled Agile framework, because it introduces agility as well. And I think it does that quite nicely if you're really a traditional organization and you want to make that switch, right? But you got to make sure that people understand these things as well. So focus on introducing the right mindset and the right culture. It's not about labeling people's squads and putting them in chapters and drawing out that whole organizational chart. That's easy. That's the simple part. Like plotting your organization and getting people in teams, that can be easy, even if you choose the self-organizing group, right? It's incredibly easy. It's making sure that they truly know what to do and have that culture you desire, because that's ultimately going to make you successful. Because if people don't understand, they need to focus on things like community, trust, enablement, cross-pollination, internal open source, then again, you're simply going to incorporate a different labeling system on your existing matrix organization. And that's really not the value for any organization. That's not why organizations want to do this in the first place, right? And if this is a model that fits, then use it. But ask yourself a question. Are you building a music player, right? This works for an organization that was one of the first music streaming players, if not like the first really popular music streaming player on the planet. I think most of us have used Spotify before other services ultimately became available. And this is also something they mentioned when others take this model and implement it. Like, yeah, this worked for us because the circumstances were right. It was 30 people to 100 to 300, right? We were building a music player, so we had all these different components that for which this sort of worked, right? But for other organizations, this might not even be the right model, and that's okay, because if you focus on the underlying things that they're doing, then you're still going to be successful in a different kind of organization. And if something doesn't work, just try something else. And this is the evolution that we've talked about, right? It's like continuously looking at like, hey, does this still fit our need now that we've grown or now that things have shifted, and just adapt. So a true agile organization is always changing, right? No big bang changes, just like smaller changes. Like we want to do things a little bit differently. All right, so let's try it as an experiment within this little tribe, and then let's sort of see if that works. And if it does work, then let's share it with the others and see if we can shift. It should be continuously evolving. And if you do that, then you become truly agile and adaptable as an organization, because agility is not only about being able to respond to market, consumer, client demand, it's also about adaptability as an organization. And I think last year really taught us that when COVID hit, it really shifted the way organizations needed to work. And if you were an agile organization to begin with, it will have been much easier to adapt to those changed circumstances than would you have been like a very traditional rigid organization that only really works with big bang change. And the final thing I want to mention, like how to use it, consider purpose and goals before enacting changes. Like, why are we even doing this? If you consider using the Spotify model, like why? What are your goals? What is the purpose? What are you looking to achieve here? Because it might not be the right solution for what you're trying to do. And you might have to cherry pick some lessons from it or some practices from it that fit your organization. You might end up with something different entirely, which is what Spotify is doing actually, and what several other truly agile organizations are doing. So I think that's definitely important to consider. So with that, I want to highlight an article that was just shared by, I think your name was Masha. I'm not really sure if I heard that right. My apologies if I got that wrong. Check out this article, Spotify as a Role Model, What You Should Know Before You Copy Their Organization Model, by Christopher Schmiedinger, I think that is. Is that the article you mentioned that also mentions the chief architect? I'm not sure if you're still here, but
yes.
Okay, yes, that was yes. Awesome. I
And
think I did actually see that, but I didn't read it all the way through.
Yeah, there's another link I'm posting, also talks about the changes to Spotify after it has been created. So those are really good.
Thank you. I will post those links on the Meetup page as well. So I'll just post like a couple of things of reference, right? So we'll get the slide, we'll get the video, we'll get the Spotify model PDF, the engineering culture videos, and the articles that were mentioned. I'm going to make sure that's all up there tomorrow. So with that, we are coming to the end of this meetup. Before I open up for more questions and conversation, I do want to highlight a couple of things. First of all, obviously, thank you for being here. First meetup of 2021. And I'd say the best attended meetup so far. Next one is February 3rd. And we're going to talk about something that I briefly mentioned in this meetup is fixing Agile in name only. A lot of organizations suffer from, hey, we're doing all the mechanics, but we're not truly agile. So what do you do then? So feel free to attend that one if interested. If you are considering attending a product owner or Scrum Master class, feel free to use the code "See You Soon!" because it will give you 10% off. So these are our upcoming classes will be shared as well. And feel free to stay in touch if you have any questions about this or about anything else Agile. I am always happy to chat. So hit me up on LinkedIn, hit us up on LinkedIn as a company. My contact details are here as well. So with that, I want to open up for any more questions, remarks, conversations, contributions that people have.
Thank you, Martin. Definitely a great overview.
Thank you,
And I
Martin.
would be,
And a great insight. Thank you so much.
I would be very
Sure.
interested. Now it seems I'm an agile coach working with different parts of Federal Reserve ecosystem, if you will. And I know that a lot of organizations, I just chatted with a couple of people that are implementing or working on some implementation of squads and tribes and chapters, right? It would be really cool if we can, in a very informal way, maybe share, what comes out of it, if you will.
And what do you mean, what comes out of it?
Well, from what I hear, different, like New York has maybe one implementation path on how they implement a Spotify not framework, if I can say that. There are Cleveland also implementing. National IT is trying to implement squads and tribes and chapters, and it would be really nice to share those experiences and see where we all see more and where we maybe differ in implementation.
I guess
Absolutely.
practices, right? So how do people
Yes.
actually apply in different organizations, different ways? I guess the Spotify model, because there's different flavors of it out there in
Oh,
the
yeah.
world.
Definitely. And I spent the past 2 years at an organization implementing this or helping them implement this across the planet. So from Asia all the way to North America. So if you want to continue the conversation at another point, feel free to shoot me a message on LinkedIn, and I'm always happy to chat about that and share those experiences in the hopes that it might be helpful to you as well. Maybe some lessons learned there. Any other questions, remarks, things people want to share?
I'd like to say, Martin, thank you so much. I've heard about the Spotify model. I've not tried to watch the videos or learn so much to understand, because I'm in Africa and Agile is just far. It's not even close in terms of adoption of the mindset.
Okay.
Because of culture that we find ourselves, very patriarchal and very traditional. So that has been a major blocker for a lot of organizations. So
Well, you'd be surprised to learn that the Ghanese police department has actually gone agile. One of my fellow trainers has been flying back and forth to Ghana to teach them Scrum. Absolutely fantastic.
I know, I heard the success story because Scrum Daddy actually talked about it. It was on TV, but it's just some aspect of the Ghanaian police, not everything, because if you watch
Obviously, yeah.
So it's just, Africa is a law, but I know it's a good start. We'll get there. So I want to say thank you for shedding light and sharing your knowledge here. Very, very, very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mercy. David, did you have a question? I saw you.
Yeah, I
up
did.
to,
One of your slides towards the end was saying, hey, be agile first. And I was just thinking regarding you, I think you said for the last 3 years you were implementing this at some bank or wherever. Sorry, I didn't
a
hear
different organization, but I won't
At
name
a
the
different
client because of the
So I have
recording.
the presumption that they weren't agile first. That's just a guess. And if they weren't, what did you trip up on? What were the many things, just a few areas that you tripped up at the different levels in the company?
That's a great question. And no, they weren't agile first. So which is part of the reason why I was there as an agile coach, right? Because they wanted to do this effort and they hired me and a bunch of other agile coaches to help them there. And a couple of the things that we tripped up on, I think part of it is what I already mentioned, right? So we were moving people into tribes, squads and tribes, and they did it really properly. I mean, they went for face-to-face meetings as far as possible, and they did spend a lot of money on it, which is a good thing in my opinion. But still, the behavior of the people didn't change, and that's like the biggest obstacle that we faced. Like we had to do really focus day-to-day coaching in order to change behavior inside squads, because they were still, some people were, and this is also where different cultures come in, right? Because these were squads that were not in a single country. So you had a squad of people composed of people in South America, North America, and Europe, and maybe even India with that. So talk about your different cultures. There's like 4 different continents in there, and there's different cultures, obviously. So the real emphasis was on making sure that how do these people collaborate? How do we get them to work together? And part of what we did obviously was getting them in the same room and working face to face and truly getting to know each other. So that was one challenge, making sure that squads were agile. The other one was like, and then, well, now that we're working on being agile, how do we work within that tribe, right? Because how do we work across different squads? We faced things like dependencies. We faced things like we're changing an existing organization. So there's existing applications, existing structures, existing reporting lines. We had product owners that were still the line managers for people in their squad, something that we all consider very undesirable. But there were existing applications that had to be maintained, whereas we were at the same time doing like a massive cloud migration. So it was like, how do you keep whatever is out there alive versus how do you build new things? How do you strike that balance? Who takes the responsibility and ownership for that? So those are some of the challenges that we faced initially and ultimately overcame to a certain degree. I'd have to say, huge organization, huge history, lots of moving parts. So obviously, when are you ever really done, right? Because things keep changing.
You're never done. So
exactly.
Two questions quickly. One on the culture. How invested, I know they spent money, but how invested was the C team? And then the second, I think you said you'd left. The second one is, where are they at now?
So they were really, really invested. The C team, they spent a lot of money on this. So they did hire like a whole army of agile coaches and scrum masters. So both a mix of contractors and full-time employees, which was the ideal mix for them because you have that outside experience, yet you retain some of that knowledge internally. And they really focused strongly on knowledge sharing within that group. So we had an agile chapter as well that was really powerful, really self-organizing. And so they were heavily invested in this. They really wanted to make this work and still want to make this work. Where did we end up? COVID, right? Budget cuts. And then what happens is that you start moving out contractors, and that's ultimately where that part ended up in their investment. So, and I'm saying this to make a point, right? So there's a degree to which the investment organizations don't want to continue that investment again, regardless of where they want to end up. So that's across the board. But they did end up converting, I think, about 3,000 people into tribes successfully, I'd say.
That's great.
To a degree, success. Like you're never really done, right? I was part of the very first tribe that they launched, right? So we had been operating the longest, which so we had the most time to learn things. So at the end, we had the most knowledge. But then after, so the tribes that were launched like latest, they still have like the longest way to go. I'd say overall, it's been a fairly, I'd say very successful effort. But that agility component still always needs work. You always need to stay on top of things.
That's great. Thanks.
Great questions, David. Thank you. So there's a couple of links being shared on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with each other. I do appreciate that. Any final questions?
Thank you. It was very helpful, Martin.
Thank you, Amit. Appreciate you being here.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
All right.
Good job, Martin. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Greatly appreciate it. Hope you all stay safe and hope to see you on February 3rd.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.